All right, well, it's an honor to be here this evening. Spain and Louisiana has always been a special love of mine in research interest and in just general interest on the side. And I thought that this might be a topic worthy of covering simply because we can do this in a way that it's light and refreshing and just for information's sake without getting into a deep dive into the technical historical dates and figures. Now there will be some of that just to set the background and the stage, but I think it's important to discuss because it's of interest to all of us here in Louisiana in that it's part of our culture and our heritage. So in our daily lives, in the food that we eat, and the music that we listen to, and the conversations and the people that we meet, Spanish heritage is always there. And so often it's buried under that layer of what we think of as Louisiana culture as being this French culture. So I'll start off with a little introduction just about French culture to set the stage, and then we'll go into the Spanish culture and where we can find Spanish culture in Louisiana today. So I have notes here, and I'll go mainly off of my notes. And I do have slides. I'll have several maps and figures and images and whatnot, just to kind of keep the storyline going. But this is a very fluid conversation, so if anybody has any questions, we will have time for questions at the end. But during the conversation, if somebody has a question or a comment, by all means ask, okay? So, good evening and welcome to Be Inspired, an offering of Baton Rouge Community College and the East Baton Rouge Parish Library. My name is Raymond Berthelot, and in addition to teaching a course on Louisiana history at BRCC, I am also the Parks Program Manager for the Louisiana Office of State Parks. Tonight we're going to discuss the many examples of Spain's heritage still present in Louisiana, stemming from the colonial periods of the 18th and 19th century, and how Spanish culture has influenced the culture of Louisiana today. All right, first success of the evening. I got the slide to change. So, but first, let's just discuss for a minute what comes to mind when we say Louisiana culture. We hear references to Louisiana's culture all the time in movies and in tourism ads, and those reference points towards our foodways and folk traditions, in our surnames and genealogies, and even in our landmarks. And for the most part, the culture that comes to mind is French culture. Indeed, when visitors come to the state of Louisiana, the first sign they encounter is a welcoming in French. Bienvenue à Louisiana. Our state's tourism is built on the notion that Louisiana's culture is French culture going back decades. Here are a few examples of this. These postcards from the early years of the 20th century are promoting the French Quarter and the French Market, both in New Orleans or the Vieux Carré, again, another French term, without reference to New Orleans' Spanish heritage. Our other language is French, and to a similar degree, French Creole. Seen here is a bar named after that famous Louisiana saying, Laissez la bon temps rouler, or let the good times roll. We've all heard that, haven't we? We've even have a government agency established for the promotion of French language in Louisiana, the Council for the Development of French in Louisiana, or CODEFIL, which, by the way, is doing tremendous work bringing French language teachers to Louisiana to teach in our schools, amongst other things. Our most recognizable cultural groups, Acadians or Cajuns and Creoles, are both rooted in French culture. But as we'll see shortly, their origins in Louisiana are actually attributed to the Spanish colonial period. And of course, Louisiana's culinary heritage is seen as and promoted as a French culinary heritage. We start off a dish with a roux and build the dish from there. We see here etouffee and other flavorful dishes. And of course, Cajun music, French, Zydeco, all French, so forth and so on. So first of all, let me say that everything that I just said about Louisiana's French culture and heritage is important and significant and instrumental in understanding Louisiana's history and culture. But there is more in the pot that makes us unique and interesting, and that is what we're going to discuss tonight. Underneath this French identity that I just pointed out, there is a very important alternative identity. Actually, several identities that we would be remiss to not discuss if we are to understand Louisiana's culture. In addition to the many contributions of the very many African and Native American peoples, the Germans, the Italians, the Anglo peoples, etc., to the cultures of Louisiana, tonight we are going to discuss the significance of the contributions of Spain and the Spanish people. I am going to keep the straightforward history to a minimum, as I don't want to bore you with a string of dates and names, but we will have to start with a bit of traditional history. In 1716, Spain embarked on the first exploratory mission in response to the French colony of Louisiana and established first a mission and a couple of years later the Presidio Nuestra Señora del Pilar de los Adayes. Los Adayes was to become the capital of La Provincia de Tejas and would remain occupied until 1762's Treaty of Fontainebleau, which turned over the French colony of Louisiana to Spain, creating the Gobernación de la Louisiana. This first foray in the resulting community of Los Adayes was in northwest Louisiana, some 15 miles west of the French town of Natchitoches, near the modern town of Robeline. While on paper, France reclaimed Louisiana in 1800, in actuality, Louisiana remained governed by the Spanish officials to the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. Between 1779 and 1781, General Bernardo de Galvez, governor of Louisiana, in aid of the United States during the American Revolution, waged war against the British, defeating them at Baton Rouge, Mobile, and finally Pensacola, thus adding West Florida to the existing Spanish Louisiana colony. After the Louisiana Purchase, the colony of Florida Occidental, or West Florida, remained a Spanish colony until 1810, when Anglo rebels defeated the Spanish at Baton Rouge and declared the West Florida Republic. 90 days later, the Republic was annexed by the United States, and the Florida Parishes became part of Louisiana, thus ending Spain's administration in Louisiana. So here's a good map that represents the area that you see here to the left under the Sabine neutral ground would be the first area in modern Louisiana that was controlled by the Spanish under Los Adayes, and then you have Louisiana proper, and this area labeled West Florida would be the area conquered by Galvez in the American Revolution, and that area by 1810 became part of Louisiana after annexation. So as you can see from the map, areas of the state of Louisiana were held by Spain and thus influenced by Spanish cultures and traditions from approximately 1716 till at least 1810. That's almost 100 years of direct influence. By comparison, the French colony of Louisiana was established in 1769, but the first town in what would become the state of Louisiana wasn't established until 1714, that being Natchitoches, and by 1763, the French colonial period was over. That's about half a century of direct influence. But of course, the French people remained, and more French cultural influences continue to pour in, as we shall soon see. First, let's talk about what is perhaps Spain's biggest contribution to Louisiana's culture and heritage, her people. Spain's policy from the earliest years as a colonizer of Louisiana was to promote immigration and people Louisiana with settlers who could defend the colony while making the colony prosperous. Requirements were that the new immigrants had to be Roman Catholic and swear allegiance to the Spanish crown. Probably the best known of these immigrants to Louisiana of Spanish origin, who brought their music, foodways, folk tales, and traditions, would be the Isleños from the Canary Islands. Between 1778 and 1783, some 2,000 Isleños arrived, establishing the communities of Galvez Town, Valenzuela, Barataria, and San Bernardino. The Isleños continue to promote their Spanish heritage and remain a close-knit community as the Los Isleños Heritage and Cultural Society and the Canary Islanders Heritage Society of Louisiana can both attest. In addition, in the spring of 1779, some 500 Malagueños, direct from Spain, settled around what was to become known as Spanish Lake, south of modern Lafayette. They named their settlement Nueva Iberia in honor of their homeland of Malaga on the Iberian Peninsula, today known as New Iberia. Today's descendants of the original 500 still take special pride in their Spanish roots, even sending high school students to visit and study in Malaga, Spain. The New Iberia community also hosts an annual Spanish fiesta. Yet another group of Hispanic origin that continues to contribute to the Spanish culture of Louisiana are the Adiaseños. These settlers, soldiers with their families, arrived at the Presidio Los Adayas in northwest Louisiana in 1718, and their descendants remain today, keeping alive the traditions such as tamale making and Roman Catholicism in rural Louisiana. As late as the early 20th century, many Adiaseños continued to speak a dialect in the home of Spain, a Spanish dialect, but unfortunately this is rapidly fading as it is for the other communities of Spanish colonial origin. Zwolle, Louisiana, where many Adiaseños today still live, hosts an annual tamale festival. In one of the great ironies of our history, Spain also contributed to Louisiana remaining significantly French in her culture and heritage. During the latter 18th century, France was losing her colonies due to war, revolution, and whatnot, and very many French colonists, rather than become British, made their way to Louisiana where they could remain Roman Catholic. By the mid-1750s, Britain began deporting thousands of Acadians from their homeland in Nova Scotia. Many of these refugees were sent back to France. Once Louisiana became a Spanish colony, after 1762, the Spanish crown sent 5 ships to transport the Acadians to Louisiana to join the other Acadian refugees who had already made it to Louisiana. The Spanish crown, which was eager to populate their Louisiana colony with Catholic settlers who might provide farmers to supply the needs of New Orleans' residents, welcomed these refugees with open arms, land, and materials to establish their communities. Of course, this group, the Cajuns, had and continue to have a tremendous impact on Louisiana's food, culture, and music. Another group who made their home in Louisiana and were welcomed by the Spanish colonial government were the refugees from Santo Domingo, or Haiti. Reeling from the Haitian Revolution, many Haitian whites and free people of color fled the island in 1792 and 1793 and easily assimilated into the Creole culture already in existence in New Orleans and the surrounding area. Even though there was a ban on the importation of slaves from Haiti into the Spanish colony, New Orleans was still rebuilding from the Great Fires of 1788 and 1794, when over 80% of the city was destroyed. So more people were willing to work for the reconstruction of the city and were welcomed into the city. Ironically, this influence of French, an influx of French-speaking peoples into the Spanish colony ensured that French would continue to be the dominant culture and language in Louisiana, even though this was all done under the Spanish colonial period. The total population of Louisiana grew from some 10,000 people at the beginning of the Spanish colonial period to 30,000 by 1803, at the end of the traditional Spanish colonial period. We often hear in Louisiana that one of the things that makes us unique is that we still have Napoleonic law. Not really the case, though. Louisiana's laws and political customs that differ from the rest of the United States derive from a similar source as the Napoleonic law, thus the confusion. However, Louisiana's laws and political customs derive from Spanish colonial governments, political structure, and influence. How so? We'll look at a couple of examples. First of all, let's look at the Cabildo. A Cabildo is not just an old building in the Vieux Carré in New Orleans. The Cabildo is a Spanish colonial municipal form of government akin to a city council. While the illustrious Cabildo in New Orleans was tasked with administering the needs of the entire colony, in conjunction with the government, of course, communities throughout the colony had smaller cabildos to administer the more local needs such as safety, levees, lighting, trade, sanitation, etc. Remnants of this system of government still exist in Louisiana today and are known as police juries, whereby its members are called jurors, and together they elect a president as their chairman. The president presides over the police jury and serves as the titular head of the parish government, much in the same way as the cabildos operated during the colonial period. In fact, 38 of the 64 parishes in Louisiana still use this system of government. Speaking of parishes, let's discuss what makes parishes unique. During the Spanish colonial period, Louisiana was politically divided into parishes, following the local ecclesiastical divisions. Following the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the Territorial Legislative Council divided the territory of Orleans, the predecessor of the state of Louisiana, into 12 counties. The borders of these counties were poorly defined, but they roughly coincided with the colonial parishes, and hence used the same names. In 1811, a constitutional convention was held to prepare for Louisiana's admission into the Union. This organized the state into 7 judicial districts, each consisting of a group of parishes. In 1816, the first official map of the state used the term parish, as did the 1845 Constitution. Here we see an image of the 1816 map with the parishes highlighted. Since then, the official term for Louisiana's primary civil divisions has been parishes. Another term we quite often hear in Louisiana related to Spanish heritage is the term Spanish land grant. Many older families of the state take pride in referring to their ancestral land as having been a Spanish land grant. How has this come to be? The answer to this question also explains why we continue to have other remnants of Spanish colonial administration and government, such as parishes and cabildos, still in existence in Louisiana today. After the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, Louisiana's new rulers, the United States of America, were presented with a unique problem: how to administer and rule a people with an already established set of laws and justice system already in place. The Digest of 1808 was a set of civil laws and codes adopted by the Louisiana legislature after much debate and back and forth, establishing for the governing of the territory of Orleans, soon to be the state of Louisiana, in 1812. In summary, it stated that the laws in place during the Spanish colonial period that were not in direct conflict with the rights established by the U.S. Constitution were to be continued to be honored in Louisiana. This is unique in the entire United States of America, where the United States of America allowed a pre-existing form of government to exist under the rules of the United States. Therefore, cabildos, or police juries, could continue to operate, parishes could continue to serve as political geographic divisions, and lands granted by the Spanish colonial authorities would continue to be recognized by the U.S. government authorities. In addition, Spanish colonial inheritance laws were kept in place, as well as many other civil rights. But not all, however. Spanish colonial laws that conflicted with the U.S. Constitution, such as those that stipulated that Roman Catholicism be the state religion, for instance, was done away with. Here we see an example of the Louisiana Code from 1817 that provides a case that makes direct reference to Spain's laws in Louisiana. So here, in this image that would be to my left, we see a direct reference. You'll note it says here on the bottom, in Spain, however, now this is an inheritance law. That's part of the civil code in Louisiana at the time. And it makes direct reference. It says, in Spain, however, the laws of which were and have continued to be ours were not repealed. There exists a particular disposition. In other words, laws that existed under the Spanish colonial government were still, and still to this day, in existence in Louisiana as long as they didn't conflict with the U.S. Constitution. Slavery laws, religious laws, those kinds of laws were done away with and changed because they were in conflict with the U.S. Constitution. But inheritance laws, land laws, certain civil codes, the use of parishes, so forth and so on, these laws remain. So while we don't have what's referred to as Napoleonic law, what we actually still have today is Spanish civil law in Louisiana, which makes us very unique. So let's talk a little bit about architecture and geography. The architecture and geography of Louisiana are yet more examples of Spain's impact on Louisiana. When we walk through the streets of the French Quarter, we are actually walking in a Spanish colonial city, very similar to Cartagena or say Guadalajara or many others. As stated earlier, New Orleans suffered major fires in 1788 and again in 1794. With the original French-style wooden buildings destroyed, the Spanish imposed their building codes requiring brick buildings, centered on small gardens and courtyards and using ornate ironwork. The new city took on the characteristics that we enjoy today as the Vieux Carré or the French Quarter. In addition, Haitian refugees during this period also brought in the style we know as the Creole cottage from Haiti. These cottages, found in the rear and downriver sections of New Orleans, are the forerunners of the shotgun house style that we see today. I've chosen this interesting map of the Louisiana Gulf Coast in 1812 to highlight some names, some geographic names that we still see in existence in Louisiana today that are of Spanish origin. Here on this American map, you'll see Spanish features such as Barataria Bay and Caminada Pass, still in use. Or Caminada Bay here, but later known as Caminada Pass, as well as French names such as Grand Isle and Grand Terre, side by side with the English names. Louisiana, and this map illustrates this from the earliest period, is not just one culture. Louisiana has, over its time, incorporated many cultures, so you'll see layers and layers of different cultures. In this one map here of the Louisiana coastline, you can pick out Native American, you can pick out Spanish, you can pick out French, you can pick out English names. So Louisiana is truly, and I'm going to use this phrase in a little bit, and you'll see where I'm going with it, but it is a gumbo of cultures. Now, one of the things about coastal Louisiana that I'll point out is this term, Barataria. Does anybody know what Barataria means or where Barataria comes from? Well, in technical sense, Barataria simply means confusion in Old Spanish, or disoriented and that sort of thing. And its first use comes from the famous Spanish novel Don Quixote, written by Cervantes in 1619, if I'm not mistaken. And Barataria was an island in this novel where men, sailors and whatnot would go and become disoriented and confused and lost and so forth and so on. So we're not really sure how Barataria comes to find its way to Louisiana, but the name is very adept because what it does is it describes an area that is indeed confusing and isolated and hard to get through, and men would go into and get lost and never be found again kind of thing. So much so that it was used by the pirates during the Spanish colonial period and later in Jean Lafitte and the early American period and whatnot as the back way into New Orleans because it was easy to lose the authorities and confuse the authorities. And once you know the area, you can make your way into New Orleans. So Barataria has a direct link to not only Spain, but that famous Spanish novel Don Quixote and Cervantes. So let's talk a little bit about New Orleans proper. In the Vieux Carré of New Orleans, not only does the Old Town still retain its Spanish colonial street names, we also see an excellent example of the town and city layout as described by the Ordenanzas de Descubrimiento Nueva Población y Pacificación de las Indias, or ordinances concerning discovery, settlements, and pacification of the Indies, issued as early as 1573 by King Philip II. This document regulated all town planning in the Caribbean and the Americas and served as a model for society. The plaza is the center. Served as a place for the townspeople to recreate, as well as for religious festivals and military training. The church was at the center point of the plaza, and the government and religious orders were equally placed. Prominent around the plaza are the merchants' houses with the shops on the bottom floors. Nearby would be the market, hospital, barracks, and further out in an orderly fashion were the houses of the less wealthy merchants, also laid out in an orderly fashion. This same model town served the Spanish Empire for many centuries and can be found in the countless Spanish countries today. And here in this New Orleans map from the Spanish colonial period, you'll see the French Quarter as we would recognize it today. The layout is exactly the same, where you have the plaza in the center, the church on the center square, the cabildo being facing the church on the left-hand side, the presbytery on the right-hand side, so you have the government and the church on either side of the church being the center of society. These shops on the side would be the homes of the merchant class, and then further out you would find the barracks and the trading areas. The market would be in this area down here along the river. This map of the French Quarter illustrates the ideal Spanish colonial community. This is what a Spanish colonial community should look like, and you'll see this layout throughout the Americas. Likewise, very many communities in Louisiana today owe their origins to the Spanish. For example, in northwest Louisiana, we have the town of Ibar, named for the Adiaseño Gilly Barbo. Closer to home, we have in Livingston Parish, the town of Coyel, named for Francisco Coyel, who was the commandant of Galvez Town in 1779. And of course, Galvez Town is in Ascension Parish, was named for its founder, Governor and General Bernardo de Galvez. Settlers from Galvez Town were responsible for the Spanish town here in Baton Rouge. Once West Florida and Baton Rouge became Spanish after the British were forced out in 1779, settlers from Galvez Town reestablished themselves here in Baton Rouge, and thus the name transferred. And as mentioned before, we have St. Bernard, New Iberia, Nunez, Capitan, Bonita, and all of these towns scattered throughout Louisiana that were established by the Spanish. There's also a plethora of natural features throughout Louisiana that are Spanish in origin as well. The number of lakes, for instance, that are named for Spanish Lake are innumerable, or even roads such as Spanish Trace or Spanish Road, also innumerable throughout the state. Louisiana's rural landscape, in conjunction with her cultural landscape, was also radically changed during the Spanish colonial period. Prior to the arrival of the Spanish, the French settlers toyed around mostly unsuccessfully with large farms and plantations relying on crops such as tobacco, indigo, and some cotton and sugarcane. With varieties, lost my place here, excuse me. Okay, with some varieties from Saint Domingue, or Santo Domingo. It wasn't until the arrival of sugarcane varieties from Cuba and the resulting success of granulated sugar production in the Spanish colonial period, 1794 to be precise, that we see the rise of a plantation economy based on sugarcane production in Louisiana. Likewise, not until the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 did cotton become a cash crop in Louisiana, also resulting in a cotton plantation economy. So, when you are driving through rural Louisiana, either through the southern cane fields or the northern cotton fields, you are driving through a landscape that is a direct descendant of Spanish Colonial's landscape. What you're looking at is Spain's impact on Louisiana's landscape that we can still see today. Unfortunately, this landscape comes at a very high human price. The rise in the plantation economy also led directly to the rise of the importation of slaves from Africa to Louisiana. It has to be said that the regulations of slaves during the Spanish colonial period were a bit more relaxed than the Americans, which would come later, meaning slaves had more opportunities to achieve freedom and then the harsher restrictions that were to follow. However, the population of slaves rose from 4,500 at the beginning of the Spanish colonial period to some 13,000 at the end of the Spanish colonial period. This influx of African enslaved peoples, as well as the rise in free people of color, Creoles in Louisiana's cultural mix, became an important ingredient in the culture and society that we have today, like a good gumbo. Speaking of gumbo, let's shift gears once again and talk about the cuisine that makes Louisiana a foodie's destination the world over. When someone mentions the cuisine of Louisiana, what comes to mind? Gumbo, jambalaya, red beans and rice, and I can go on. But just these three will illustrate the point. For all three, and some others that I'll mention, are representative of Spain's presence here in Louisiana. Let's start with jambalaya. This highly seasoned rice dish that typically combines ham, pork, sausage, and rice with butter, onions, parsley, ground cloves, bay leaves, salt, black pepper, and cayenne pepper. Very similar, the paella of Spain combines various vegetables, seasons, meats, and rice, some of which include green beans, butter beans, tomatoes, olive oil, paprika, saffron, salt and pepper, chicken, rabbit, and pork. Both paella and jambalaya can be made in a seafood version as well. And during the colonial period, someone who we would call jambalaya would equally recognize paella and vice versa. Red beans and rice was also introduced to the Creole cuisine by the Spanish. This staple of Louisiana's cuisine evolved from the Spanish dish moros and cristianos, a highly seasoned white rice and black bean dish often associated with Cuban cuisine. Red beans and rice are still traditionally served on Mondays and can be seasoned with a ham bone from Sunday's meal, a very traditional Spanish cultural feature. In North Louisiana, one can find tamales, introduced to the area by the Acadians, and Natchitoches meat pies, which are a traditional local food very similar in origin to the empanada, or meat stuffed in a fried dough shell. There is also a tamale tradition in the Delta region of Louisiana, introduced by Hispanic field hands working side by side with African American laborers. Gumbo is one of those classic Louisiana meals whose origins epitomizes what makes Louisiana unique and interesting. In the typical gumbo, one can find the influences of Spain in the sausage and in the very nature of a caldo, or a fish soup, which is traditionally shared with the French, the possibility of okra, an ingredient introduced by African slaves during the colonial period, seasonings such as filet or sassafras and bay leaves introduced by Native Americans, and perhaps cayenne, an introduction from Native Americans from other parts of the Spanish Empire coming into Louisiana. Evolved as an excellent example of a true and unique Louisiana dish with the origins of all of these nationalities being poured in. So, and this dish, again, has its origins only because of the Spanish colonial period's openness to introducing these cultures into the Louisiana mix. So gumbo really does represent a signature examples of Louisiana's Spanish cultural uniqueness. So, a couple of concluding remarks. And after the Louisiana Purchase, when Louisiana entered her next chapter as part of the United States, Spain's presence in Louisiana did not stop there. According to a recent article on NOLA.com, one Jose Pepe Hugo was advertising and hosting bullfights in New Orleans in the 1840s and 50s, carrying on a tradition going back to the colonial period. In fact, according to the 1850 census, some 1,400 Spaniards were living in New Orleans. Now these are Spaniards from Spain who were just coming in to Louisiana, not the Spanish Colonial Louisiana, but to Louisiana as part of the United States. This is almost half of all Spaniards living in the United States at this time. Keep in mind that the total population in New Orleans was only about 116,000 in 1850. The image here is reportedly an image of Hugo's bull ring in Algiers in 1849. And Spain's presence, interest, and influences in Louisiana has continued to grow after all of these years. In 2001, Northwestern State University, in conjunction with the Louisiana Folklife Program, Office of State Parks, and others, created an exhibit to introduce the people of Spain to the complexities of Louisiana's cultures using a small collection of folk crafts representing ancestors who settled in Louisiana under the colonial administration of Spain. The exhibition, which was displayed in Valencia, was entitled Louisiana Bienvenidos a Todos. In 2003, the Alexandria Museum of Art hosted the Heart of Spain exhibit to wonderful reviews, only to be followed by the Recovered Memories exhibit in 2018, housed in the New Orleans Cabildo and hosted by the Louisiana State Museum. King Felipe VI and Queen Leticia of Spain were honored guests and were granted the keys to the city of New Orleans in commemoration of that city's 300-year anniversary. And here you can see a picture of the King and Queen of Spain receiving the keys to the city of New Orleans. So, inspired by Spain's heritage in Louisiana, many communities continue to host festivals and events which celebrate our mutual connections. This is nothing new, for bullfights were being held in Algiers and Gretna in the 1840s, and most recently, believe it or not, a decade or so ago in Gonzales, Louisiana, there was a small bullfight that was hosted, mainly by Mexican immigrants, but a Spanish bullfight nonetheless. One of the biggest fiestas annually held is now the Fiesta de San Fermin, or Running of the Bulls, which I have a picture of here, which is a major festival held in July in New Orleans. Modeled after the Fiesta in Pamplona, a roller derby women have replaced the bulls in this fun-filled activity that continue to grow every year. If you haven't been to the Running of the Bulls in New Orleans, I highly, highly recommend it. It's a whole lot of fun. One can go on with the examples of Spain's influence on Louisiana, for we haven't yet touched on the impact of Latin Americans in Louisiana and other areas of the former Spanish Empire, such as the Philippines, on our culture, heritage, customs, and traditions and foodways, but we should save that talk for another time. Muchas gracias, and thank you for your interest, and if I can answer any questions, I'd be more than happy to. That concludes the presentation. Questions? Comments? Tomatoes you want to throw? Well, good. Thank you all for coming. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for the opportunity. And I look forward to doing something similar, hopefully, once again. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I was curious if Spain left any kind of impact on relations with the Native Americans that you could or came across?
Yes. That's a very, very good question. So, oftentimes we tend to think of, in looking at American history, as America moving through Native American lands and by hook or crook, gaining territory for westward expansion. which is based on British policy, of course. Spain's was very different from either the British or the French, in that Spain had this idea that in order to expand its colony throughout the Americas, right, Native Americans were to be treated, if the Native Americans were willing to accept Spanish law and become Roman Catholic and declare their allegiance to the Spanish crown, they would be considered Spanish subjects and would be given the rights and privileges that entails. So Spain's policy with the Native Americans in Louisiana was more of a negotiate and trade and a building of alliances. And because Spain knew in establishing its colony that it really depended on these alliances. There's a great story, there's a couple of great stories where, so to go back to Los Anayas, which is a military establishment, and it actually governed the military establishment at San Antonio. The San Antonio mission in Presidio was at war with some of the western Apache tribes, whereas the Los Anayas mission was an ally with many of the tribes, such as the Caddo and whatnot. But soldiers from Los Anayas were assisting this other Presidio, and they were captured somewhere in the Oklahoma region. The soldiers that were from San Antonio were executed. The soldiers that were from Los Anayas were set free and allowed to go back, even though they were both Spanish soldiers, because the Native Americans saw, well, their allies were their enemies, even though they're fighting for the same crown. And there's many stories like that where when Los Anayas was still a counterpoint to the French community of Fort St. John in Natchitoches, Fort St. John was attacked by the Natchez Native Americans. Spain gathered up its allies, Los Anayas, and went to the rescue of the French. And so here you have Native Americans fighting Native Americans, but allied with the Spanish in defending the French. Very weird, because it doesn't fit the traditional model. But a lot of alliances, a lot of trade agreements and whatnot, and basically an attempt to incorporate Native Americans into Spanish society. So you'll still see very large mixtures of people, small communities that are Native American and Spanish. They have both things going on. So.
Good question.
Mm-hmm.
So the names that appears on the Louisiana flag, that's the name for people on the Iberia that came from Spain to kind of establish the...
Exactly. So this is some of the, and we didn't even get into the genealogy and the surnames and stuff. But these would be, so this is a festival in New Iberia. So these would be the names of settlers, the original names of the settlers that settled in New Iberia, whose surnames are still found in the community today. And because Louisiana is French-centric, we think of everything as French. You'll see some of these names like Romero and Segura and Aguilar is there, but a lot of people will think of these as French names or Cajun names when there's so many more names. And I mean, you could just go down in the different communities, the names that are Spanish in origin. Hidalgo, Gonzalez, Moran, for instance, a common Spanish name. And there are hundreds and hundreds of these Spanish families that are still in Louisiana today, that because of the French influence, we think of them, and they think of themselves as being French in culture, because over time everything has become almost Cajun culture. But there's all of these different viewpoints in there. But yeah, these are families from directly from Malaga, Spain, that settled in New Iberia.
Can you touch on the American Revolution, Spain's contribution in Louisiana to the American?
Absolutely. So, 1779, the the United States is fighting for its independence. Spain has been an enemy of Britain for the longest time, over multiple years and whatnot. So the governor of Louisiana, Galvez, recognizes that in order to help the United States, Spain can open up a second front. So the King of Spain, first thing that happens is the King of Spain declares war on Britain. This gives the green light to Galvez to attack Britain. Now the closest place he can attack Britain is West Florida. West Florida, and it might be helpful if I go back to one of my previous slides. Okay, there we go. That's the one. So, this is West Florida here. And you have Baton Rouge, you have Mobile, and the capital of Pensacola. So, Galvez builds an army in New Orleans consisting of Native Americans, of Cajuns, Isleños, all representing the entirety of the Spanish colonial system here in Louisiana. And they attack in 1779 Baton Rouge and defeat the British in Baton Rouge. He then takes his army, he sends a group up and they take over Natchez, Mississippi as well. Then Galvez takes his army and defeats the British again at Mobile. He then pulls his army back and recruits a navy from Cuba along with his soldiers from Louisiana, and they attack Pensacola. By this time it's 1781. And the British are sending forces down, so it really is helping the Americans and George Washington fight in that theater of the war. And the interesting thing about Galvez in declaring or going into battle on Pensacola, the ship channel into Pensacola is very tight and hard to get to. And evidently there's a storm and there's some trouble, and all of these Spanish captains of these ships are telling Galvez, who's on the flagship, this is too risky. We can't do this, we can't do this. We already beat them at Baton Rouge, we already beat them in Mobile, let's just not fight Pensacola. And Galvez, this is a kind of insight to the kind of guy Galvez was, he said, all of y'all stay out here, I'm going in with my ship. If I have to fight the British on my own, I will. In Spanish, he says, yo solo, I alone. And he takes his ship into Pensacola. All the other sailors and captains, they said, okay, well, if he's going in, we're going in too. And of course, Galvez defeats the British at Pensacola, and Florida becomes a Spanish territory, and Galvez reclaims Florida for, at least the western half, for Louisiana. So the King of Spain honors Galvez with the title Yo Solo. So that is part of his insignia. He gets to keep that as part of his name. And after he leaves the governorship of Louisiana, he goes on to become the governor of the entire province of New Spain, which is based in Mexico City, which of course Louisiana is part of at this time. So that's kind of a summary of Spain's role in the American Revolution. And did someone else have a question?
I was curious what the allegiance of the Spanish here were to Spain. Considering some of the European settlers, some were more identified themselves as British.
Well, it was very, very, very tricky at first. When Louisiana first became a Spanish colony, the first Spanish governor to come in was a gentleman by the name of Ulloa. And he was a scientist. It was an honorary title that he's now the governor of Louisiana. He comes in with a ship and he says, all right, guys, just keep on doing what you're doing. I'm just here to be here kind of thing. Well, the French people that were here, they were highly insulted. One, they wanted to remain French. They sent a delegation to France saying, hey, what are you doing? We want to stay French and whatnot. And they actually revolted against this new governor and forced him out. Well, long story short, the Spanish crown wasn't going to have any of this. So they sent in a military governor by the name of O'Reilly, known as Bloody O'Reilly for obvious reasons. And he came in with a military, with ships and whatnot. He put down the rebellion. He executed the ringleaders of the revolt. And he says, we're here, we're in charge, no ands, ifs, and buts about it. You're going to follow our laws and our regulations. And so, I mean, that put an end to any kind of revolt or talk of revolt or anything like that. But under Spanish authority, Louisiana prospered as a colony. So the French settlers who were here, they prospered as well. So after a while, all of those feelings just kind of went away. And I think by the most part, the French settlers who were here in Louisiana from the French colonial period, they were okay with it because they saw that the Spanish government really was open to incorporating French and French ideas and whatnot, French peoples more importantly, into the Spanish cultural system. So. Yes?
As the librarian, are there any really interesting collections of documents or books or stories about Spanish history in Louisiana?
Ooh, hundreds, if not thousands.
And where would we find them?
You know, at the library right here, I started, and I'll have to complete it and get it to you. I started doing just a list of books that one can find at the main branch of this library. And I got to, 2 pages plus, and I still and I was just going down, and I hadn't hit the ones that I really wanted to hit yet. And it's like, this is a little more project than I want to knock out in an hour or two. So if you just go into, the website, and I just typed in for a general search, Spain, Louisiana. Click, and there are lots of books. Some of the good authors that have written on Louisiana are Gilbert Dinn, Paul Hoffman from LSU has written on some things, and there really are a lot of works. And then you can start doing specific work on Spanish governors in Louisiana, such as Galvez. There's a lot of books on Galvez and whatnot. Now, as far as genealogical work or primary source documents and whatnot, there's a lot of genealogical summaries that are in most library collections that you can find that date to the Spanish colonial period if you're tracing your family history and culture and whatnot. And there's also a lot of primary source documents. The State Museum in New Orleans has a lot of primary source documents. Several archives in town in New Orleans and in Baton Rouge. Archdiocese archives have a lot of Spanish colonial documents and so forth. So they're scattered out there, but once you start getting into it, it's like going down a rabbit hole. There's a lot. Yeah. Thank you all very much. Look forward to seeing everybody again.